Jeremiah Stone stood at the makeshift altar next to the heaviest woman he'd ever seen, his calloused hands trembling as thunder rumbled overhead despite the cloudless Arizona sky. The simple gold band slipped onto Abigail Morrison's thick finger with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Matthews announced, but his voice cracked like old leather. "Doctor." Elias Morrison watched from the front pew, his steel-gray eyes recording every detail with the intensity of a man studying specimens under glass. When Abigail lifted her veil, something flickered behind her dark eyes. Not shame, not resignation, but a glittering intelligence that made Jeremiah's breath catch in his throat. The church fell silent except for the scratch of the doctor's pen against paper. "Congratulations, Mr. Stone," Abigail whispered, her voice carrying an accent he couldn't quite place. "You have no idea what you've just agreed to." That night, when she turned the bedroom key with deliberate precision, Jeremiah realized the promised cow was the least of his concerns. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, Jeremiah Stone had been a man with everything to lose and nothing left to give. The drought of 1876 had been merciless to Apache Creek, Arizona territory, turning his once proud ranch into a graveyard of cracked earth and bleached cattle bones. Each morning, he'd wake to the sound of silence where lowing herds once filled the air, the emptiness echoing through rooms that still held the ghost of laughter. Sarah's rocking chair sat by the window, untouched since scarlet fever had claimed her and their baby son, Thomas, that bitter winter. Jeremiah kept their photograph in his shirt pocket, the edges worn soft from his thumb tracing their faces during the long, hollow evenings. At sunset, he'd take out his violin, Sarah's favorite time of day, and play the lullabies she used to hum while nursing little Thomas. The music drifted across the barren landscape like a prayer no one was listening to anymore. "A man's word is all he's got left when everything else is gone," his father used to say. But even words felt worthless when the bank notice crumpled in Jeremiah's pocket declared 30 days until foreclosure. $500 might as well have been 5,000. He'd sold everything of value except Sarah's wedding ring, which he couldn't bear to part with, and the violin that kept her memory alive. 20 miles south, in the territorial doctor's sprawling adobe house, lived the woman who would change everything. Abigail Morrison moved through her adopted father's home like a shadow, her substantial frame wrapped in plain brown dresses that strained at the seams. At 24, she carried herself with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned early that the world judged harshly and forgave little. Dr. Elias Morrison had found her 12 years ago, a broken child whose real name was Margaret Standing Bear. Her Cheyenne family had perished in a cavalry raid that left her orphaned and alone, rescued by the Army surgeon who promised to give her a civilized life. What he hadn't mentioned was his fascination with human behavior, his obsession with understanding love and loss through careful observation and documentation. Margaret had learned to become Abigail, burying her native tongue and customs beneath layers of enforced domesticity. She read her adoptive father's medical journals by candlelight, absorbing knowledge about healing and human nature while he believed her simple and grateful. Her weight had grown with her grief, each pound a shield against a world that had taken everything she'd ever loved. Dr. Morrison himself carried his own ghosts. His wife and son had died of cholera while he was stationed at Fort Apache, their deaths haunting him with questions about fate, love, and the mechanics of human attachment. He'd convinced himself that science could solve what the heart couldn't understand, that careful observation and controlled circumstances could unlock the mysteries of human connection. When drought and desperation brought Jeremiah Stone to Murphy's saloon that fateful March evening, three broken souls were about to collide in ways none of them could imagine. The doctor's proposal would seem like salvation, but salvation often comes wearing the mask of something else entirely. The whiskey burned Jeremiah's throat, but not nearly as much as the shame burning in his chest. Murphy's saloon reeked of tobacco smoke and broken dreams, filled with men who'd learned that the Arizona Territory gave nothing without taking twice as much in return. The bank notice lay crumpled beside his glass, the words "Final Notice" bleeding through the cheap paper like a death sentence. "Sometimes desperation makes the choice for you," Jeremiah muttered to his reflection in the amber liquid, his father's voice echoing in his memory. 3 generations of Stones had worked that land, built something lasting from nothing but grit and determination. Now it would die with him, another casualty of drought and debt. "Mr. Stone?" The voice belonged to Dr. Elias Morrison, whose shadow fell across the scarred wooden table like an omen. The territorial doctor rarely frequented Murphy's establishment, preferring the refined atmosphere of the hotel restaurant. His presence here now felt like divine intervention or devilish temptation. "Doc Morrison," Jeremiah gestured to the empty chair. "Buying whiskey for dying ranchers now?" Morrison settled his lean frame into the chair, his steel-gray eyes studying Jeremiah with clinical interest. "Actually, I have a proposition that might solve both our problems." He signaled Murphy for 2 glasses. "I understand you're facing foreclosure. 30 days. The admission tasted bitter. $500 I don't have and can't get. "I can provide that amount," Morrison said carefully, "in exchange for a service." Jeremiah's hand instinctively moved to the photograph in his pocket. "What kind of service?" "Marriage." The word hung between them like smoke. "My daughter Abigail needs a husband, and you need financial stability. She's not much to look at, I'll grant you, but she has a good heart and strong hands for ranch work." The proposition hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. He'd buried his wife barely 8 months ago, still talked to her photograph each evening, still heard Thomas's laughter in the wind. The idea of replacing them felt like sacrilege. "She's willing?" he asked quietly. Morrison's smile held no warmth. "She's 24 and unmarried. In this territory, her options are limited. Besides, what choice do either of you have now?" Over the following weeks, Morrison arranged 2 formal meetings at his sprawling adobe house. Jeremiah arrived for the first visit wearing his only good shirt, his hair slicked back with pomade that couldn't quite hide his desperation. Abigail served tea in delicate china cups, her movements graceful despite her substantial frame. She barely spoke, offering only polite responses to his awkward attempts at conversation. But Jeremiah noticed things others might miss. Her hands, though thick, moved with surprising gentleness as she poured tea. When she thought no one was watching, her dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed to take in everything and reveal nothing. She knew about cattle breeding, casually mentioning details about bloodlines and grazing rotation that surprised him. Dr. Morrison remained present throughout both visits, scribbling notes in a leather journal with the intensity of a man documenting something far more significant than courtship rituals. Strange medical equipment cluttered the house's back rooms, brass instruments and glass vials that seemed oddly sophisticated for a frontier doctor's practice. "Still waters run deeper than most folks realize," Abigail said during their second meeting, the first complete sentence she'd offered him. Her voice carried an accent he couldn't identify, something that spoke of distant places and different tongues. The wedding preparations moved with uncomfortable efficiency. Morrison insisted on specific details. The ceremony must be recorded in the church registry, witnessed by at least 6 townspeople, and concluded with a reception at his house. He produced an ornate marriage contract written in legal language that made Jeremiah's head spin. "Just formalities," Morrison assured him, but his eyes held the gleam of a man completing an important experiment. Jeremiah sold Sarah's wedding ring to buy Abigail a simple gold band, the transaction feeling like another small death. The jeweler, old Hans Mueller, counted out the coins with sympathetic silence. "Sometimes a man's got to let go of yesterday to grab hold of tomorrow," Mueller offered quietly. "You're Sarah. She'd understand." Meanwhile, Abigail worked alone in her room, sewing a wedding dress from brown cotton that would accommodate her figure. Through her window, she watched the desert landscape with eyes that seemed to see beyond the horizon. At night, she read by candlelight, not romance novels or domestic guides, but her father's medical journals and books about human behavior that most women would never touch. The evening before the wedding, unusual storm clouds gathered over Apache Creek, despite the ongoing drought. Old-timers muttered about omens and unsettled spirits, but Dr. Morrison seemed oddly pleased by the atmospheric disturbance. "When the sky looks troubled, wise folks take shelter," warned Tom Bradley, the hotel proprietor. But Morrison just smiled and made another notation in his ever-present journal. As Jeremiah prepared for sleep in his empty cabin, he pressed Sarah's photograph to his chest one last time. Tomorrow would bring changes he couldn't foresee, a future built on necessity rather than love. But survival demanded sacrifice, and he'd already lost everything that truly mattered. The wedding ceremony concluded with awkward handshakes and forced congratulations that felt more like condolences. Jeremiah helped his new wife into the wagon, the springs groaning under her weight as thunder continued to rumble overhead despite the cloudless sky. The ride to his ranch passed in silence, broken only by the creak of wheels and the distant howl of coyotes announcing the approaching night. Abigail sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap, still wearing the brown cotton dress she'd sewn herself. Her wedding bouquet, desert wildflowers Morrison had insisted upon, lay wilted between them like a small funeral arrangement. Jeremiah stole glances at her profile, noting how the fading light softened her features and made her dark eyes seem to hold depths he couldn't fathom. When they reached the modest cabin that would now be their home, Abigail climbed down from the wagon without assistance, her movements surprisingly graceful for someone of her size. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, surveying the simple interior with an expression Jeremiah couldn't read. "It's not much," he offered, suddenly conscious of the bare walls and sparse furniture. Sarah's rocking chair still sat by the window, her sewing basket untouched on the side table. "It's honest," Abigail replied, the first word she'd spoken since leaving the church. "Honest is more than most folks can claim." As darkness settled over the desert, they moved through the evening routine with the careful politeness of strangers sharing space. Abigail prepared a simple supper from supplies Morrison had sent with them, moving around the small kitchen with an efficiency that suggested she'd been planning this meal longer than their brief courtship would indicate. Jeremiah watched her work, noting small details that didn't quite fit the picture Morrison had painted of his simple daughter. She seasoned the beans with herbs he didn't recognize, handling the knife with the precision of someone comfortable with sharp instruments. When she thought he wasn't looking, she paused to examine the medical supplies on his shelf with professional interest. "You know about doctoring?" he asked. Her hand stilled on a bottle of laudanum. "Father taught me some things, enough to help when needed." After supper, they sat in the main room as the wind picked up outside, carrying the scent of distant rain that never seemed to arrive. Jeremiah retrieved his violin from its case, running his fingers along the strings Sarah had loved to hear. "Would you mind?" he asked. Abigail shook her head, settling into Sarah's rocking chair without asking permission. As the first notes filled the room, something changed in her posture. The careful mask she'd worn all day slipped slightly, revealing a vulnerability that made her seem younger despite her size. When he finished the lullaby Sarah had favored, Abigail spoke softly. "That was beautiful. Melancholy, but beautiful." "My wife's favorite song," Jeremiah admitted. "She used to hum it while nursing our son." "Tell me about them." The request surprised him. Morrison had never asked about his previous family, seeming to prefer that Jeremiah arrive at this marriage as a blank slate. But Abigail's dark eyes held genuine interest, not mere politeness. "Sarah was everything good about this world," he began, the words coming easier than expected. "Laughed like wind chimes, sang while she worked, never complained about the isolation or the hardships. And Thomas," his voice caught. "Thomas was barely walking when the fever took them both. I couldn't afford the medicine that might have saved them." Abigail leaned forward in the rocking chair. "Scarlet fever?" "Dr. Morrison said there was a treatment available back east, but the cost—" Jeremiah shrugged helplessly. $500, the same amount I owed the bank." Something flickered across Abigail's face, an expression too quick to interpret, but intense enough to make him pause. She recovered quickly, offering the sympathetic murmur expected from a new wife hearing about her predecessor's tragedy. "Grief is a heavy burden to carry alone," she said finally. As the evening progressed toward bedtime, the easy conversation gave way to awkward silence. They were married now, legally bound, but strangers nonetheless. Jeremiah had prepared himself for the physical aspects of marriage, assuming duty would guide them both through the initial discomfort of intimacy between virtual strangers. But when they entered the small bedroom, Abigail's demeanor shifted completely. Gone was the quiet, compliant woman who had served tea and listened to his stories. In her place stood someone altogether different, purposeful, determined, almost predatory in her focus. She moved to the door and turned the key with deliberate precision, the metallic click echoing in the small space like a gunshot. When she faced him again, her eyes held that strange glitter he'd glimpsed during the ceremony, but now it burned brighter, more intense. "Sit down," she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that made him obey without thinking. Jeremiah sank onto the edge of the bed, watching in growing confusion as Abigail began to remove her wedding dress. But instead of the white undergarments he expected, she revealed clothing he'd never seen before, intricately beaded leather and cloth that spoke of craftsmanship from a different culture entirely. "What are you doing?" he managed. She straightened, and for the first time since he'd met her, Abigail Morrison stood without the hunched shoulders and downcast eyes that had defined her presence. She looked him directly in the face, and when she spoke, her voice carried the unmistakable cadence of someone speaking a second language with careful precision. "My name is not Abigail Morrison," she said, each word weighted with significance. "And I am not Dr. Morrison's daughter." The room seemed to tilt around Jeremiah as the implications of her statement crashed over him. The careful courtship, Morrison's insistence on specific wedding details, the strange medical equipment, the way she'd examined his medicine supplies, none of it had been coincidence. "Then who are you?" he whispered. She moved to the small window and pulled the curtain shut, blocking out the moonlight and trapping them both in the amber glow of the single candle. When she turned back to face him, the woman he'd married had vanished completely, replaced by someone whose very presence radiated a dangerous intelligence. "My real name is Margaret Standing Bear," she said, and in those words Jeremiah heard the echo of wind across vast plains and the ghost of languages older than the territory itself. "And you, Jeremiah Stone, have just become part of something much larger than a simple marriage of convenience." The revelation hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Jeremiah stared at the woman who had been Abigail Morrison just moments before, his mind struggling to process the transformation. Margaret Standing Bear moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for someone of her size, her dark eyes reflecting the candlelight with an intensity that made him feel like prey being studied by a predator. "You're Cheyenne," he said, the words falling flat in the small room. "I was," she replied, settling into the wooden chair across from him with careful precision. "Before soldiers came to our winter camp when I was 12, before they killed my parents and 3 brothers, before Dr. Morrison rescued me from the massacre he helped plan." The weight of her words settled on Jeremiah's chest like a stone. He'd heard stories about the cavalry raids, whispered conversations in saloons about military actions that never made it into official reports. But hearing it from someone who'd lived through it, who carried the scars in her voice, made his stomach turn. "Morrison was there?" "Army surgeon attached to Colonel Whitman's unit." Margaret's voice remained steady, but her hands clenched in her lap. "He documented everything. How long it took people to die, how children reacted to seeing their parents killed, what psychological effects trauma had on survivors. I was his prize specimen." She stood and moved to a small trunk he hadn't noticed before, hidden beneath the window. From it, she withdrew items that made his breath catch: beaded moccasins, a leather medicine bag, and what appeared to be a diary bound in doeskin. "For 12 years I've been his experiment in civilizing the savage," she continued, her voice carrying bitter irony. "He fed me medicines that made me gain weight, told me it was for my health. He recorded everything I said, how I moved, what I remembered about my family. He was writing a book about transforming Indians into productive citizens." Jeremiah felt his world tilting further off its axis. "And the marriage?" "The culmination of his research." Margaret opened the doeskin diary, revealing pages covered in her careful handwriting. "He wanted to prove that even the most unlikely woman could find love if properly positioned. That physical attraction was less important than circumstance and necessity." "But you agreed to it." Her laugh held no humor. "I've been planning my escape for 3 years, ever since I found his real journals hidden in the basement. This marriage was my chance to disappear, to find what's left of my people." She looked at him directly. "I never expected to find someone worth staying for." The admission hung between them, raw and unexpected. Jeremiah studied her face, searching for deception, but finding only a vulnerability that seemed to cost her everything to reveal. "You're saying you have feelings for me?" "I'm saying that watching you grieve your family, seeing how you still talk to their photograph, hearing you play music that breaks your heart every night, it changed something in me." Margaret closed the diary, her fingers trembling slightly. "You loved them completely, without reservation. I'd forgotten that kind of love existed." Jeremiah stood and moved to the window, his mind reeling. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly under starlight, vast and unforgiving as the situation he found himself trapped in. "Morrison expects you to report back to him. About us. About—" He gestured helplessly. "Every conversation, every interaction, every sign of growing attachment between us." Margaret joined him at the window, her presence both comforting and terrifying. "He has recording devices hidden throughout this house, crude ones, but effective enough. He's been documenting everything since the day you agreed to marry me." The violation of privacy hit him like a physical blow. His grief, his memories of Sarah and Thomas, his tentative attempts at conversation with his new wife, all of it observed and recorded for Morrison's twisted research. "Where?" he demanded. Margaret pointed to small holes drilled in the walls, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. "Kitchen, main room, bedroom. He's been listening to widowers for years, studying how they process grief and form new attachments. You're not his first subject." Jesus. Jeremiah ran his hands through his hair, feeling exposed and manipulated. How many others? At least 6 that I know of. Widowed men in desperate circumstances, women with complicated backgrounds who needed husbands. He'd arrange the marriages, document the relationships, then publish papers about human behavior and social adaptation. What happened to them? Margaret's silence spoke volumes. When she finally answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. The men usually died in accidents after about 2 years. The women disappeared, relocated to other territories where Morrison had colleagues conducting similar research. The implication hit him like ice water. He's planning to kill me. Not immediately. First, he needs to complete his observations about how physical intimacy develops between mismatched couples. Then, once he has enough data, she shrugged, the gesture encompassing a world of horrible possibilities. Jeremiah moved away from the window, pacing the small room like a caged animal. Everything made sense now. Morrison's insistence on specific contract terms, his detailed questions about Jeremiah's feelings and reactions, the way he'd pushed for quick marriage despite Abigail's supposed shyness. "We have to leave," he said. "Tonight." "Leave for where?" Margaret's question was practical, cutting through his panic. "He has connections throughout the territory, military contacts, other doctors, judges who owe him favors, and I'm still legally his ward, an Indian woman with no rights and no protection. Then we go somewhere he can't follow. Mexico, California. Even if we could travel that far without money or supplies, he'd find us eventually." Margaret sat back down, her shoulders sagging under the weight of their impossible situation. "And there's something else you need to know." Jeremiah stopped pacing, dreading whatever revelation was coming next. "Your wife and son," she said quietly. "The medicine Morrison said was too expensive. He had it. He always had it. But giving it to them would have interfered with his study of how widowed men cope with loss." The words hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. He sank onto the bed, staring at her in horrified disbelief. "You're saying he let them die deliberately? I found the medical supplies in his basement laboratory. Boxes of treatments for scarlet fever, diphtheria, cholera, all the diseases that kill families in isolated areas. He withholds treatment from some subjects and provides it to others, documenting the different outcomes." Rage filled Jeremiah's chest, hot and consuming. Sarah's face appeared in his memory, her fever-bright eyes, her desperate gasps for breath, the way she'd whispered Thomas's name even as her own life slipped away. All of it unnecessary. All of it preventable. "I'm going to kill him," he said, the words coming out flat and certain. "That's what he's counting on." Margaret's voice cut through his fury like cold water. "Violent reaction to betrayal, leading to self-destructive behavior that eliminates the subject without requiring direct action from the researcher." "It's in his notes." Jeremiah looked at her, this woman who carried her own grief and rage with such careful control. "Then what do you suggest?" "We give him what he wants to see," she said, her dark eyes reflecting the candlelight like a cat's. "Two people falling in love despite impossible circumstances. We let him record our conversations, document our growing intimacy, believe his experiment is succeeding perfectly." "While planning what exactly?" Margaret smiled, and for the first time since her revelation, it reached her eyes. "While I gather evidence of his crimes, and you learn everything he doesn't want you to know. He's not the only one who can conduct research, Jeremiah Stone." She moved to the trunk again and withdrew more items, papers, photographs, what appeared to be medical records. 12 years of watching, listening, and documenting everything he thought I was too simple to understand. Names, dates, locations of his other experiments, proof of his collaboration with the cavalry, evidence that could hang him if presented to the right authorities. Jeremiah studied the papers she spread across the small table. They were covered in her careful handwriting, detailed observations about Morrison's methods, his contacts, his plans. This wasn't the work of a simple adopted daughter. This was the systematic intelligence gathering of someone planning a war. You've been preparing for this for years. I told you, I've been planning my escape. But escape isn't enough anymore. Margaret's voice hardened with resolve. Too many people have died because of his twisted curiosity. Someone needs to stop him. And if we're caught, then we die together instead of separately. She met his eyes directly. But at least we'll die trying to do something right. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the scent of distant storms that might never arrive. Jeremiah looked at this woman who had been thrust into his life through deception and manipulation, who carried secrets that could destroy them both, who offered him a chance at justice for the family he'd lost. "Pain shared is pain halved, joy shared is joy doubled," he said, remembering something his grandmother used to say. Margaret nodded slowly. "Then we share it all, the pain, the plan, and whatever comes after." They spent the rest of the night planning, their voices low and careful, aware that every word was being recorded for Morrison's research. But between the lines of their staged conversations, they built something real, a partnership born of shared trauma and common purpose, the foundation of trust that would sustain them through whatever trials lay ahead. When dawn broke over the Arizona desert, they had become what Morrison never intended his experiment to create. Two people genuinely committed to protecting each other, no matter the cost. The summer weeks that followed their wedding night revelation passed in a careful dance of deception and growing intimacy. By day, Jeremiah and Margaret played their assigned roles, the grateful rancher and his devoted wife, allowing Morrison's hidden recording devices to capture conversations about their developing relationship. By night, they planned their counterattack with the methodical precision of military strategists. Margaret's transformation from the quiet, submissive Abigail to her true self had been gradual but unmistakable. She moved through the small cabin with increasing confidence, her Cheyenne heritage showing in the way she read weather patterns, identified useful plants in the desert, and treated Jeremiah's chronic back pain with herbal remedies Morrison had never taught her. Her weight began to drop as she stopped taking the medications Morrison had prescribed, revealing the strong, graceful woman she'd been before 12 years of chemical suppression. "The heart knows no master but itself," she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the desert red. She spoke loudly enough for Morrison's devices to record, but her eyes held private meaning as she squeezed Jeremiah's hand. Their staged affection gradually became genuine. Jeremiah found himself looking forward to their evening conversations, marveling at Margaret's intelligence and dry sense of humor. She spoke 3 languages fluently, possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of medicinal plants, and could calculate complex mathematical problems in her head. Skills Morrison had deliberately ignored while documenting her supposed simplicity. "You're nothing like he described," Jeremiah told her one night as she helped him repair a section of fence damaged by the previous winter's storms. "Neither are you," she replied, threading wire through the posts with practiced efficiency. "He portrayed you as a broken man who'd accept any substitute for his dead family. But you're not trying to replace them. You're trying to honor them." The observation struck him as profoundly true. His grief for Sarah and Thomas remained, but it no longer consumed him. Margaret hadn't filled the hole they'd left. Instead, she'd helped him understand that love could expand rather than replace, that his heart was capable of holding both memory and hope. Their investigation into Morrison's activities revealed the full scope of his twisted research. Hidden in his basement laboratory, they found detailed files on dozens of subjects spanning 15 years. The pattern was always the same: identify vulnerable individuals, create circumstances that force them into desperate situations, then document their responses to emotional manipulation and trauma. "Look at this," Margaret whispered during one of their midnight reconnaissance missions, showing him a thick folder labeled Grief Response Studies, Male Subjects. Inside were detailed psychological profiles of widowed men throughout the territory, notes about their financial situations, and predictions about how they'd respond to offers of remarriage. Jeremiah's own file was there, filled with observations that made his skin crawl. Morrison had been watching him for months before approaching with the marriage proposal, documenting his evening ritual of talking to Sarah's photograph, noting how he isolated himself from the community, recording the gradual deterioration of his ranch and mental state. "He knew exactly how desperate I was," Jeremiah realized, reading Morrison's clinical descriptions of his behavior. "Desperation was the point," Margaret said grimly. "Desperate people don't ask inconvenient questions. They're grateful for any solution, even one that seems too good to be true." But the most damning evidence lay in Morrison's correspondence with military officials and other territorial doctors. The letters revealed a network of men conducting similar experiments throughout the Southwest, sharing data about psychological manipulation of indigenous and frontier populations. They spoke casually about arranging accidents, relocating subjects, and eliminating witnesses who became problematic. "We're not dealing with one madman," Margaret said, spreading the letters across Jeremiah's kitchen table. "This is organized, systematic. They're using the frontier as their personal laboratory." The realization that Morrison was part of a larger conspiracy both terrified and motivated them. Their evidence could potentially save dozens of other victims, but it also meant their enemies had resources and connections they'd barely begun to understand. Their growing partnership extended beyond their investigation. Margaret taught Jeremiah basic Cheyenne words and showed him how to read the desert's subtle signs, where to find water during drought, which plants could provide food or medicine, how to move silently across rocky ground. In return, he shared his knowledge of ranching, teaching her to repair equipment, read cattle behavior, and manage the complex logistics of frontier farming. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it," Margaret said one evening as they practiced shooting behind the barn. Morrison's experiments had made her an expert marksman, part of his research into how trauma affected motor skills and reflexes. Their physical relationship developed with careful tenderness, both of them damaged by loss, but healing through genuine connection. Margaret carried scars from the massacre that killed her family, flinching sometimes when Jeremiah moved too quickly or spoke too loudly. He still woke some nights calling Sarah's name, confusion and guilt warring in his chest until Margaret's gentle touch reminded him where he was. "Love builds bridges where hate builds walls," she murmured one night after he'd startled awake from a nightmare about Thomas's fever. Her arms encircled him with patient strength, offering comfort without demanding explanation. As August arrived with its punishing heat, they noticed changes in Morrison's behavior. His visits became more frequent and intense, his questions more probing. He seemed increasingly agitated about something, checking his pocket watch obsessively and muttering about schedules and deadlines. "He's preparing to end the experiment," Margaret realized after finding a letter he'd dropped during one visit. The correspondence mentioned conclusion protocols and subject disposal time frames. "How long do we have?" "Based on his previous patterns. Maybe 2 weeks before he arranges your accident and my relocation." The pressure of their deadline forced them to accelerate their plans. They'd identified the territorial judge who might be willing to hear their evidence. Judge Harrison Crawford, an honest man whose own son had died under suspicious circumstances while stationed at Fort Apache. But reaching him would require a dangerous journey to Tucson, carrying evidence that could hang them all if discovered. Meanwhile, their relationship with the local community remained complicated. Some neighbors had accepted their interracial marriage with frontier pragmatism. Love was rare enough in the harsh territory that folks didn't question its particular forms. But others whispered about that Indian woman and the desperate rancher who'd married beneath his station. Tom Bradley from the hotel was among their few open supporters. "A man's worth ain't measured by his wallet but by his word," he told Jeremiah after defending Margaret against snide comments in the general store. "And far as I can see, both of you keep your promises." But their most unexpected ally emerged from an unlikely source. Father Miguel Santos, the elderly Mexican priest who served the territory's scattered Catholic population, approached them after Sunday service with startling news. "I have been watching Dr. Morrison for many months," he said quietly, his weathered hands gripping his rosary. "Several of my parishioners have died in accidents after becoming involved with his medical research. I believe you and your wife are in great danger." The priest's observations corroborated their evidence in chilling detail. He documented a pattern of deaths and disappearances centered around Morrison's activities, recorded suspicious visits from military officials, and noted the doctor's unusual interest in traumatized individuals. "There are others who suspect," Father Miguel continued. "A federal marshal named Samuel Rodriguez has been investigating irregularities in territorial medical records. If you have evidence, he might listen." This revelation offered hope, but also increased urgency. If federal authorities were already investigating, their own amateur detective work could either provide crucial support or interfere with official proceedings. They needed to make contact quickly, before Morrison realized how much they'd discovered. As they prepared for what might be their final weeks together, either as fugitives or as corpses, Jeremiah and Margaret faced the bitter irony of their situation. Morrison's experiment had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations, but not in the way he'd intended. Instead of creating a relationship based on desperation and manipulation, he'd brought together two people who genuinely cared for each other, who were willing to risk everything for justice and truth. "Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted," Margaret observed as they reviewed their evidence one last time, preparing to either flee or fight. Jeremiah nodded, thinking about Sarah and Thomas, about Margaret's murdered family, about all the lives Morrison had destroyed in pursuit of his twisted research. Their love had been born from tragedy, but it had grown into something strong enough to demand justice for the dead and protection for the living. The desert wind howled outside their cabin, carrying the scent of distant storms that might finally bring rain to the drought-stricken land. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Two souls joined not by Morrison's manipulation, but by their own choice to trust, protect, and love despite the darkness that had brought them together. The first sign of trouble came with the morning mail. Morrison arrived at their cabin earlier than usual, his normally composed demeanor cracked with barely contained agitation. He carried a telegram that trembled in his hands, and his steel-gray eyes darted nervously between Jeremiah and Margaret, as if seeing them for the first time as potential threats rather than experimental subjects. "Federal marshals are asking questions in Tucson," he announced without preamble, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Someone has been spreading lies about my medical practice, making accusations about my research methods." Margaret continued kneading bread dough at the kitchen table, her face carefully neutral, but Jeremiah caught the slight stiffening of her shoulders. They'd known this moment would come. When Morrison realized his activities were under scrutiny and began eliminating evidence, including witnesses who knew too much. "What kind of accusations?" Jeremiah asked, genuinely curious about how much the authorities had discovered. "Nonsense about unethical treatment of patients, falsified research data, collaboration with corrupt military officials." Morrison waved dismissively, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning coolness. "Jealous colleagues trying to discredit work they're too narrow-minded to understand." I'm sure the truth will come out, Margaret said quietly, her words carrying multiple meanings that only Jeremiah could interpret. Morrison's gaze fixed on her with sudden intensity. Yes, the truth. That's exactly what concerns me. He moved closer to the table where she worked, studying her face with the clinical attention he'd always applied to his subjects. You've been different lately, Abigail. More confident, more present. It's exactly the kind of positive change I'd hoped to document. Marriage suits me, she replied simply, but Jeremiah heard the steel beneath her gentle tone. Indeed it does, which is why I've decided to accelerate my publication schedule. Morrison pulled out his ever-present notebook, flipping through pages covered with his cramped handwriting. I need to complete my observations and compile the final data within the next few days. Time is becoming a factor. The threat was barely veiled. Morrison was preparing to conclude his experiment permanently, which meant arranging their deaths before federal investigators could reach them. Jeremiah felt his pulse quicken, but years of frontier life had taught him to hide emotional reactions when survival was at stake. "Anything we can do to help?" he offered. "Actually, yes. I need you both to come to my house this evening for final interviews and medical examinations. Detailed documentation of your current physical and psychological states will be crucial for my research conclusions." Margaret's hands stilled on the bread dough. "Both of us?" "Of course. The study requires comparative data about how marriage affects both partners in an arranged union." Morrison's smile held no warmth. "I've prepared a special dinner to mark the occasion. Consider it a celebration of how far you've both progressed." After Morrison left, they worked in tense silence, both understanding that the evening invitation was likely a death sentence disguised as scientific procedure. Morrison had access to drugs that could simulate heart attacks, poisons that mimicked natural illness, and medical expertise to make murder look like unfortunate coincidence. "He's going to kill us tonight," Margaret said finally, abandoning any pretense that their conversation wasn't being recorded. "Let him try," Jeremiah replied, moving to the gun cabinet he'd kept locked since their wedding. "I'm done being anyone's laboratory rat." But as they prepared their defenses, catastrophe struck from an unexpected direction. A rider approached at full gallop, dust billowing behind his horse as he raced toward their cabin. Jeremiah recognized Tom Bradley from the hotel, his face grim with urgent news. "Federal marshals arrived in town this morning," Bradley gasped, sliding from his lathered horse. "But they're not investigating Morrison. They're looking for you two. There's warrants out for your arrest." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Warrants for what? Murder, theft, conspiracy to incite Indian rebellion. Bradley's words came in rapid bursts. "Morrison's claiming you killed his real daughter, and that Margaret here is an escaped prisoner who's been impersonating her. Says you've been stealing medical supplies and planning to arm hostile tribes." Margaret's face went ashen. "How is that possible?" "He's got witnesses. Men claiming they saw you at the original crime scene, documents proving Margaret's real identity, evidence of stolen drugs and weapons." Bradley looked between them with desperate sympathy. "He's turned the whole thing around, made himself look like the victim, and you two like the criminals." The brilliant manipulation took Jeremiah's breath away. Morrison had anticipated the possibility of federal investigation and prepared counter-accusations that would eliminate his subjects while protecting himself. By positioning them as murderers and Indian conspirators, he'd ensured that their deaths, whether by law enforcement or vigilante justice, would be celebrated rather than investigated. "We have evidence," Margaret said desperately. "Proof of his crimes, documentation of his experiments. Evidence you stole from his house while impersonating his daughter," Bradley pointed out grimly. "Who's going to believe the word of an escaped Indian prisoner and a desperate rancher against a respected territorial doctor?" The trap was perfect in its simplicity. Morrison had spent months establishing their desperate circumstances, documenting their motives for theft and deception, creating a narrative that painted him as a grieving father victimized by cunning criminals. Any evidence they'd gathered would be dismissed as forgeries created to support their lies. "How long before they get here?" Jeremiah asked. "Maybe an hour. They're gathering a posse in town. Some of the men are already talking about not bothering with a trial." Bradley's meaning was clear. Lynch law was coming to Apache Creek, and they were the intended victims. Margaret moved with sudden decisiveness, gathering supplies and weapons with practiced efficiency. "We run? Now, before they surround the cabin." "Run where?" Jeremiah demanded. "He's got the whole territory thinking we're murderers and traitors. There's nowhere to hide." "There's always somewhere," she replied, strapping a knife to her thigh beneath her skirt. "My people survived cavalry hunts for generations. I know places the white man's never seen." But as they prepared to flee, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the desert. Multiple riders moving fast, too many to fight and too close to escape. Through the window, Jeremiah could see dust clouds from several directions, indicating that Morrison had orchestrated a coordinated sweep to prevent their escape. "Too late," Bradley said grimly, drawing his own pistol. "They're already here." The first shots came without warning, shattering the cabin's front window and sending splinters flying across the room. Margaret dove behind the overturned table while Jeremiah returned fire through the broken glass, his rifle cracking in measured responses to the chaos outside. "Jeremiah Stone, Margaret Standing Bear." The voice belonged to someone with authority, likely the federal marshal Morrison had corrupted. "You're surrounded. Come out with your hands visible and you won't be harmed." "Like hell," Jeremiah muttered, reloading with practiced speed. The siege continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Bullets thudded into the cabin's log walls, men shouted orders and threats, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. Margaret proved as deadly with a rifle as she'd claimed, her shots finding targets with precision that spoke of years of survival training. But they were outnumbered and outgunned, trapped in a building that was rapidly being reduced to splinters around them. Worse, smoke began curling under the door. Someone had set fire to the back of the cabin, intending to burn them out or roast them alive. "This is how it ends," Margaret said, blood trickling from a graze on her temple, "burning to death in a cabin, branded as criminals and traitors." Jeremiah looked at this woman who had become everything to him: partner, ally, lover, and friend. Morrison's experiment had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, creating a bond strong enough to face death together rather than surrender separately. "Then we make it count," he said, kissing her fiercely, as flames began to lick at the walls around them. "When monsters shed their masks, heroes find their courage." But as they prepared for their final stand, the sound of new gunfire erupted outside. Different weapons, different voices, men shouting orders that didn't match the posse's previous commands. Through the smoke and chaos, they heard someone calling their names not in accusation but in rescue. Help had arrived from the most unexpected source, and their story was far from over. The gunfire outside shifted dramatically, becoming a three-way battle as new voices shouted commands in Spanish and heavily accented English. Through the smoke and chaos, Jeremiah heard Father Miguel's distinctive voice calling out orders, followed by the thunder of additional horses arriving at full gallop. "Federal Marshal Rodriguez, stand down your weapons!" The authoritative voice cut through the confusion like a blade. "These people are under federal protection as witnesses in an ongoing investigation." Margaret grabbed Jeremiah's arm, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Rodriguez, that's the marshal Father Miguel mentioned, the one investigating territorial medical records." The siege transformed into a standoff as two groups of lawmen faced each other across the burning cabin. Through the broken windows, they could see men in different uniforms pointing weapons at each other, while someone, presumably Marshal Rodriguez, attempted to establish authority over the situation. Marshal Patterson, you are operating on falsified warrants issued by a man currently under federal investigation. Rodriguez's voice carried absolute certainty. Dr. Elias Morrison is wanted for multiple counts of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. Any action against these witnesses constitutes obstruction of a federal case. That's impossible, came the reply from the corrupt marshal who'd arrived with the posse. Dr. Morrison is a respected citizen who's been victimized by these criminals. I have sworn statements, physical evidence. You have fabricated documents provided by a man who's been systematically murdering territorial residents for 15 years. Rodriguez's tone brooked no argument. Stand down immediately, or face charges of conspiracy and accessory to murder. The standoff continued as flames crept closer to their hiding place behind the overturned table. Jeremiah could feel the heat building against his back, smoke making his eyes water and his lungs burn. They were trapped between corrupt lawmen outside and deadly fire inside, with no guarantee that Rodriguez's intervention would save them. Then Margaret did something that stunned everyone into silence. She stood up slowly, her hands visible but not raised in surrender, and walked toward the burning doorway. When she spoke, her voice carried the unmistakable cadence of her native language before switching to clear, precise English. I am Margaret Standing Bear, daughter of Chief White Thunder of the Northern Cheyenne, and I claim the right to speak under the Treaty of Fort Laramie. Her words rang across the desert with ceremonial authority. I have knowledge of crimes committed against my people and against citizens of this territory. I demand to be heard by federal authority. The legal invocation was brilliant. By claiming her tribal identity and referencing federal treaty obligations, Margaret had created a jurisdictional nightmare that would require careful handling by any legitimate law enforcement officer. Even corrupt marshals would think twice about violating federal treaty rights in front of witnesses. "Miss Standing Bear," Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying relief and respect. "Federal Marshal Samuel Rodriguez, investigating territorial crimes on behalf of the Department of Justice. You and Mr. Stone are under federal protection as material witnesses. Please exit the building safely." As they emerged from the burning cabin, Jeremiah got his first clear look at their rescuers. Rodriguez was a weathered Mexican-American man in his 50s, accompanied by 6 federal deputies and, surprisingly, Father Miguel. The priest carried a thick satchel that presumably contained evidence he'd been gathering about Morrison's activities. More shocking was the presence of Tom Bradley and 3 other townspeople, all armed and clearly on their side. The hotel owner stepped forward with grim determination. "Marshal Rodriguez, I've got signed statements from 15 residents who witnessed suspicious deaths over the past 5 years," Bradley announced. "Dr. Morrison's been poisoning this territory long enough." The corrupt Marshal Patterson found himself surrounded by federal officers, local witnesses, and a priest who apparently commanded considerable respect among the Mexican and Indian communities. His posse began looking uncertain, some men quietly holstering their weapons as they realized they'd been manipulated into participating in what might be attempted murder. "This is all lies and conspiracy," Patterson blustered, but his confidence was cracking. "Morrison is a respected doctor." "Morrison is a butcher," Father Miguel interrupted, opening his satchel to reveal stacks of documentation. "I have records of every suspicious death, every disappeared person, every family destroyed by his experiments. 37 documented cases over 15 years. The number hit everyone like a physical blow. 37 lives lost to Morrison's twisted research, 37 families destroyed by his systematic manipulation of grief and desperation." Jeremiah thought about Sarah and Thomas, about Margaret's murdered family, about all the other victims whose stories would never be told. "Where is Morrison now?" Rodriguez demanded. Gone, Bradley admitted grimly. Soon as word reached town about federal marshals asking questions, he packed up and disappeared. Took his equipment, burned his files, cleared out completely. Margaret stepped forward, her voice steady despite the trauma of the past hours. He didn't burn everything. We have copies of his research notes, correspondence with military officials, evidence of his collaboration in Indian massacres. Everything he thought he'd destroyed. Rodriguez's eyes lit up with professional satisfaction. Miss Standing Bear, you and Mr. Stone have just provided the missing pieces to a puzzle we've been working on for 2 years. Morrison's part of a network spanning multiple territories. Doctors, military officers, territorial officials, all conducting illegal experiments on frontier populations. The revelation that Morrison's crimes were part of a larger conspiracy both vindicated their investigation and highlighted the scope of corruption they'd uncovered. As federal deputies began taking statements and securing evidence, the magnitude of what they'd survived became clear. But their ordeal was far from over. Patterson and his corrupt posse were arrested on charges of conspiracy and attempted murder, but Morrison remained free somewhere in the vast Western Territories. Worse, his Confederates would soon learn that their network had been exposed, potentially triggering a desperate attempt to eliminate witnesses and destroy remaining evidence. "You're both in considerable danger," Rodriguez explained as they stood watching their cabin burn to ash and embers. "Morrison and his associates have resources, connections, and motivation to prevent this evidence from reaching federal prosecutors. We can offer protection, but it would mean leaving Arizona Territory immediately." Margaret looked at the ruins of their home, then at Jeremiah, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight and something deeper, a quiet strength forged by survival and loss. "This land holds too much blood, too many bad memories. Perhaps it's time to go somewhere new." Jeremiah nodded slowly, thinking about the life they'd built here, brief as it had been. The ranch was mortgaged and worthless now, the cattle long dead from drought, but he'd found something more valuable than land or livestock. He'd found a partner worth fighting alongside, worth starting over with. "There's something else," Father Miguel said quietly, approaching them with obvious reluctance. "Miss Standing Bear, your tribal connections. We've located surviving members of your family." Margaret's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her soot-stained face as the priest continued. "Your uncle, Chief White Thunder's brother, survived the cavalry raids. He's been searching for you for 12 years, following rumors and reports across multiple reservations. When I sent word through tribal networks about our investigation, he contacted federal authorities immediately." The news was overwhelming. After 12 years of believing herself the sole survivor of her family's massacre, Margaret learned that she wasn't alone in the world. Her uncle had not only survived but had spent years trying to find her, never giving up hope that she'd escaped the soldiers who'd destroyed their people. "He's traveling here now," Father Miguel continued. "Should arrive within the week, accompanied by federal officials who are investigating military crimes against tribal populations. Your testimony, combined with Morrison's records, could finally bring justice for the massacre that killed your parents." As dawn broke over the Arizona desert, painting the mountains gold and red, Jeremiah and Margaret stood together amid the ashes of their old life, facing the possibility of something entirely new. Federal protection would take them away from this harsh land where they'd found each other, but it would also provide opportunities to heal, to build something lasting, to help ensure that Morrison's victims received the justice they deserved. "Truth may bend, but it never breaks," Margaret said, echoing words her grandmother had taught her in childhood. She took Jeremiah's hand, her fingers strong and certain despite everything they'd endured. Rodriguez was organizing transportation to get them safely out of the territory before Morrison's Confederates could mount a counterattack. Within hours, they would leave Apache Creek forever. carrying with them evidence that could transform frontier justice and testimony that could prevent future atrocities. But as they prepared for departure, the distant sound of approaching horses reminded them that their enemies had not given up. Morrison might have fled, but his network of corrupt officials and military collaborators would fight viciously to protect themselves. The battle for justice was far from over, and the cost of victory remained uncertain. 3 months later, the territorial courthouse in Santa Fe buzzed with unprecedented activity as federal prosecutors presented their case against what newspapers had dubbed the Frontier Experimentation Conspiracy. Margaret sat in the witness chair, her testimony flowing with quiet authority as she described 12 years of systematic abuse disguised as medical research. She wore traditional Cheyenne dress that her uncle had brought when he finally found her, beaded leather that spoke of pride reclaimed and identity restored. Jeremiah watched from the gallery, marveling at her transformation from the broken woman Morrison had created into this poised advocate for justice. Her weight had normalized, her posture straightened with confidence, and her voice carried the unmistakable ring of truth that had already convinced a packed courtroom of Morrison's guilt. "Doctor!" "Morrison documented everything," Margaret continued, gesturing toward the mountains of evidence spread across the prosecutor's table. "He believed his research was so important that future generations would thank him for advancing human understanding, regardless of the cost in lives." The defense attorney, a nervous man clearly overmatched by the federal case, attempted to discredit her testimony by focusing on her racial identity and her years of supposed deception. But Margaret had learned to turn such attacks into strengths, using each challenge to reveal more damaging information about Morrison's methods. "You're correct that I deceived people for years," she replied calmly. "Dr. Morrison trained me to be the perfect experimental subject, compliant, grateful, and apparently simple-minded. He never suspected that his savage was documenting his crimes with the same thoroughness he applied to his research." The courtroom erupted in murmurs as she produced additional evidence, coded diary entries she'd kept throughout her captivity, sketches of Morrison's equipment and methods, even transcripts of conversations she'd memorized word for word. 12 years of forced observation had created the most detailed record of psychological torture ever presented in a territorial court. Dr. Morrison himself sat at the defendant's table in shackles, his once commanding presence reduced to that of a cornered animal. Federal marshals had captured him attempting to cross into Mexico with a fortune in stolen research funds and a new identity prepared for continuing his work south of the border. His arrest had triggered a cascade of revelations as other members of his network sought plea agreements to avoid similar fates. The defendant's correspondence reveals a systematic program of human experimentation spanning 15 years and 7 territories, the federal prosecutor announced, holding up letters that detailed coordination between corrupt doctors, military officers, and territorial officials. 37 confirmed deaths, countless more disappearances, and deliberate withholding of medical treatment to create research opportunities. Judge Harrison Crawford, the honest man they'd hoped to reach months earlier, presided over the trial with grim determination. His own son's suspicious death had been linked to Morrison's network, providing additional motivation to ensure justice was served completely and publicly. As testimony continued, the full scope of Morrison's crimes became clear. He hadn't acted alone. A network of like-minded researchers had used the frontier's isolation and limited law enforcement to conduct experiments that would have been impossible in more civilized areas. Indian reservations, isolated ranches, mining camps, and military outposts had all served as laboratories for studying human responses to trauma, manipulation, and controlled stress. Margaret's reunion with her uncle, Chief White Thunder's brother, whose name was Running Wolf, had provided another crucial element to the prosecution's case. The elderly Cheyenne leader had brought tribal historians and witnesses who could testify about the cavalry massacre that killed Margaret's family, a raid Morrison had helped plan specifically to acquire research subjects from among the survivors. The white doctor told soldiers where to find our winter camp, Running Wolf testified through an interpreter, his weathered face showing no emotion despite the horrible memories he was sharing. He said he needed to study how children survive when families are destroyed. My brother's daughter was not rescued, she was collected. The revelation that Morrison had actively participated in planning the massacre that orphaned Margaret sent shockwaves through the packed courtroom. This wasn't simply a case of medical malpractice or research ethics violations. This was deliberate genocide conducted under the guise of scientific inquiry. Jeremiah's own testimony focused on Morrison's manipulation of grieving families and his systematic withholding of medical treatment to create research opportunities. When he described watching Sarah and Thomas die while Morrison possessed medicine that could have saved them, several jury members were visibly moved to tears. He told me the treatment was too expensive, that I should accept God's will, Jeremiah said, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of his words. But we found the medicine in his laboratory, expired and unused. He let my family die to study how I would respond to grief and desperation. The defense's attempts to portray Morrison as a dedicated researcher whose methods were merely ahead of their time crumbled under the weight of documented evidence. Letters between conspiracy members revealed casual discussions about eliminating unproductive subjects and harvesting useful data from terminal cases. There was no scientific nobility in their work, only the cold calculation of predators who viewed human suffering as raw material for their twisted ambitions. As the trial neared its conclusion, Morrison finally took the stand in his own defense. His testimony revealed a man so divorced from normal human empathy that he genuinely believed his actions were justified by their potential scientific value. Every great advance in human knowledge requires sacrifice, he declared, showing no remorse for the lives he'd destroyed. Future generations will understand that temporary suffering by a few individuals was necessary to benefit all humanity. The prosecutor's cross-examination systematically dismantled Morrison's grandiose self-image, revealing him as a mediocre researcher whose work had produced no meaningful scientific insights, only suffering and death. Dr. Morrison, in 15 years of human experimentation, have you published a single peer-reviewed paper that advanced medical knowledge? The research was ongoing. That's a no. Have you developed any treatments or cures that helped patients? The data required further analysis. Another no. Have you contributed anything to human knowledge beyond detailed documentation of how people suffer when you torture them? Morrison's silence spoke volumes. His life's work had been reduced to its essence, not scientific research but elaborate sadism dressed in academic language. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Crawford sentenced Morrison to death by hanging, with the execution scheduled for the following month. His co-conspirators received lengthy prison sentences, with several facing additional trials in other territories where their crimes had occurred. As they left the courthouse that final day, Margaret and Jeremiah walked hand in hand through Santa Fe's plaza, their legal ordeal finally concluded, but their future just beginning. Federal authorities had offered them new identities and protection, but they'd chosen instead to remain themselves, scarred but unbroken, committed to building something positive from the ashes of Morrison's destruction. From the ashes of sorrow, joy grows stronger, Margaret said, quoting words her grandmother had taught her in childhood. The trials had been exhausting, but they'd also been cleansing, a public reckoning that transformed private trauma into shared understanding. Margaret's uncle had invited them to live with the Cheyenne, to learn traditional ways and help bridge the gap between white and native communities. It was an opportunity to heal not just their own wounds, but to work toward preventing future atrocities through education and understanding. But first, they had a promise to keep. Sarah and Thomas's graves needed proper markers, and other victims of Morrison's conspiracy deserved to be remembered and honored. Justice had been served in the courtroom, but the work of healing would continue for years to come. As the New Mexico sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they prepared for the next chapter of their improbable love story. A tale that had begun with deception and desperation, but had grown into something beautiful and enduring. 2 years after Morrison's execution, the spring of 1879 brought new life to the high plains of Montana Territory, where Jeremiah and Margaret had built their home among the northern Cheyenne. Margaret stood at the window of their log cabin, her hands resting on her swollen belly as she watched her husband teaching violin to a group of tribal children in the meadow below. The music drifted up to her on the warm breeze, a lullaby she recognized as one Sarah had loved, now transformed into something that honored both past and present. Their son would be born within the month, and Margaret had already chosen his name, Thomas Standing Bear Stone, bridging both their histories in a single identity. The pregnancy had been difficult at first, her body struggling to trust in happiness after so many years of trauma, but surrounded by the healing presence of her recovered family and Jeremiah's unwavering love, she had learned to believe in joy again. Running Wolf, her uncle, approached the cabin carrying a bundle of freshly cut sage for the birthing ceremony. At 73, he moved with the careful grace of a man who had survived cavalry raids, reservation hardships, and the long search for his lost niece. His presence in their lives had been a gift beyond measure. Not just the restoration of family bonds, but the opportunity to reclaim cultural traditions Morrison had tried to destroy. "Little warrior grows strong," he said in Cheyenne, placing his weathered hand on Margaret's belly. "He kicks like his mother fought the white doctor's lies." Margaret smiled, speaking her native language with increasing fluency as her uncle patiently corrected years of forced forgetting. The Cheyenne community had welcomed both her and Jeremiah with generosity that still amazed them, understanding that their love story represented something larger than individual healing. It was a bridge between worlds that had been violently separated. Jeremiah's integration into tribal life had surprised everyone, including himself. His natural musical ability translated beautifully to traditional Cheyenne instruments, and his farming knowledge proved invaluable in helping the community establish sustainable agriculture on their assigned lands. More importantly, his genuine respect for Cheyenne customs and his willingness to learn had earned him acceptance as more than just Margaret's white husband. "He teaches our children to make music with the white man's instruments," Running Wolf continued, watching his great-nephew by marriage lead the young musicians through a simple melody. "But he learns our songs too, honors our ways. This is how healing happens, not by forgetting the past, but by building something new from what remains." The wisdom in those words reflected the philosophy that had guided their recovery from Morrison's trauma. They hadn't tried to pretend the horrors hadn't happened or to simply move on as if the past didn't matter. Instead, they had worked to transform their pain into purpose, their survival into service to others who had suffered similar losses. Margaret's testimony in Morrison's trial had inspired other victims to come forward, leading to additional prosecutions across multiple territories. Federal authorities had established new oversight procedures for territorial medical practices, and tribal advocates now had formal channels to report suspicious deaths or disappearances. The changes wouldn't bring back the dead, but they might prevent future atrocities. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the dirt road that connected their cabin to the main settlement. A familiar figure rode toward them, Tom Bradley, who had made the journey from Arizona Territory with news from their old home. He visited twice yearly, carrying letters and updates about the ongoing legal proceedings against Morrison's co-conspirators. "Afternoon, folks," Bradley called out, dismounting with the stiffness of a man who'd spent too many hours in the saddle. "Got news from Santa Fe you'll want to hear." Jeremiah joined them on the porch, his violin still tucked under his arm as the Cheyenne children gathered around to hear whatever stories the visitor might share. Bradley had become something of a local legend for his role in exposing Morrison's crimes, and the children loved hearing about the dramatic courthouse scenes he'd witnessed. "Last of Morrison's network got sentenced yesterday," Bradley announced with satisfaction. "Colonel Whitman received life in prison for his role in planning the cavalry raids. Captain Williams got 20 years for falsifying military reports. Dr. Harrison in Colorado Territory got the death penalty for his experiments on mining families." The news brought closure to a chapter of their lives that had seemed endless during the darkest moments. 37 confirmed victims had finally received justice, their deaths acknowledged and their killers punished. More importantly, the public trials had exposed the corruption that had made such atrocities possible, leading to reforms that would protect future generations. "There's something else," Bradley continued, producing a thick envelope from his saddlebags. "This came through legal channels. Compensation fund established by the federal government for Morrison's victims and their families." Margaret accepted the envelope with trembling hands, not because of the money it contained, but because of what it represented. Official recognition that they had been wronged, that their suffering mattered, that society bore some responsibility for the crimes committed in its name. The amount was substantial enough to secure their future, but more valuable was the acknowledgement that they deserved compensation for what they'd endured. As evening approached, the community gathered for their weekly storytelling circle, where elders shared traditional tales and younger members contributed their own experiences. Tonight, Margaret would tell their story again, not the clinical testimony she'd delivered in court, but the human narrative of love emerging from loss, of healing growing from trauma. "When I was young," she began, settling into the circle with her hand on her swollen belly, "my grandmother taught me that the heart has room for both sorrow and joy, that one does not diminish the other. I thought she was wrong when soldiers killed my family. I thought grief would fill me completely, leaving no space for anything else." The children listened with rapt attention as she continued, describing her years with Morrison, her marriage to Jeremiah, their discovery of each other's true selves amid deception and manipulation. "But grandmother was right," Margaret concluded, her voice carrying across the circle to where Jeremiah sat among the tribal elders. "Love doesn't replace what we've lost. It honors it by proving that beauty can still exist in a world that also holds terrible darkness." Jeremiah added his own perspective, speaking in the mixture of English and Cheyenne that had become their household language. "Sometimes the greatest treasures come from the most unexpected places. I thought I was trading my dignity for a cow, but I found a partner worth more than all the cattle in Montana Territory." The story always ended with the same lesson, one that had become central to their understanding of survival and recovery, that healing wasn't about forgetting or forgiving, but about choosing to build something meaningful from the pieces that remained after devastation. As the stars emerged over the Montana plains, Margaret felt her son kick vigorously, as if responding to the music and stories surrounding him. This child would grow up knowing both sides of his heritage, understanding the darkness that had brought his parents together, but also seeing the light they had created by refusing to let that darkness define them. Later that night, as she and Jeremiah lay in their bed listening to the sounds of the sleeping community around them, Margaret reflected on the improbable journey that had brought them to this moment of peace. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Everything we went through, all the pain that brought us together?" Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment, considering her question with the thoughtfulness she'd learned to love about him. "I regret that Sarah and Thomas died," he said finally. "I regret that your family was murdered. I regret that Morrison was allowed to hurt so many people for so long." He turned to face her in the darkness, his hand finding hers beneath the quilted blanket her Cheyenne sisters had made for them. "But I don't regret that their deaths led me to you, or that your survival allowed us to find each other. Sometimes God writes straight with crooked lines, and sometimes the best things in life grow from the worst soil." Outside their window, the night breeze carried the scent of sage and wildflowers, of new grass and fertile earth, of a world renewing itself as it had for countless generations before them and would for countless generations after. Their son would be born into this world of possibility, carrying forward the best of both their legacies while leaving behind the worst of their shared trauma. Emotional message for American seniors. 200 words. Have you ever felt like life gave you a raw deal, that your golden years aren't quite as golden as you'd hoped? This story of Jeremiah and Margaret reminds us that it's never too late for a second chance at love, purpose, and belonging. At ages when society often writes us off, these two survivors found each other and built something beautiful from the ashes of their deepest losses. Their love didn't erase the pain of losing spouses or children. It honored those memories while proving that our hearts have room for both sorrow and joy. For those of us facing empty nests, health challenges, financial worries, or the loneliness that can come with retirement, their story whispers a powerful truth. Unexpected blessings often arrive wearing the disguise of ordinary Tuesday afternoons. Sometimes the family we create is stronger than the one we were born into. Sometimes the love that matters most comes not from passion, but from two people deciding to build something meaningful together, day by day, choice by choice. Your story isn't over. Your heart isn't too old. Your dreams aren't too late. Questions for audience engagement. When did an unexpected blessing arrive in your life disguised as something ordinary or unwanted? How did you find the strength to rebuild after a major loss or life transition? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.